You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. We were really
a Mamamia podcast.
Jacinta Parsons was 22 when she started feeling unwell. The kind of unwell that, well, it lingered. Some days she couldn't get out of bed. Other days she couldn't eat. But one thing remained constant. Every day she woke up feeling like absolute crap. And her doctors, they had no answers.
You just progressively learn how to live with the growing evidence that something's not right.
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. Jacinta Parsons is a professional radio host. She does the afternoon shift at ABC Radio in Melbourne, and there's always a little bit of extra pressure on me when I'm interviewing an interviewer.
I'm almost a bit nervous. This is so exciting.
Stop it, me too.
Come on.
A proper broadcaster and everything. I'm the one that should be nervous, and I am. Since her early 20s, Jacinta has been living with an invisible illness. It's one that affects over 75,000 Australians and isn't talked about often.
A lot of your life you spend working out how to hide it, because a lot of the time it's much harder to do that really lengthy explanation around the experience that you're having, because there's not much time for it really in our world.
Half of Australians live with some kind of illness or condition that you can't see from the outside, which is why Jacinta has written a book about her experience called Unseen: The Secret World of Chronic Illness. And she joins me now to answer all of my questions. And just a heads up, it gets a little bit graphic at some points. Not upsetting, but a little bit intense. Jacinta, during the first part of lockdown, when everyone was watching the death toll really closely, and with every announcement of a death, they would say how old that person was. And if it was a young person, or younger person, they would say they had underlying health conditions usually, or they might say that. And it wasn't until I read your book that I realised how I felt a sense of relief every time they said that, because I don't have an underlying health condition. But what did it feel like for you?
It felt like you sometimes feel, I guess, when you have an invisible illness, in that you're desperate to tell the world outside of you that you're not being overly freaked out by it or frantic about it, but there is a real genuine concern for your life with the coronavirus, because I was on immunosuppressive drugs, as were so many people with chronic illnesses, not to mention the illnesses themselves. It's almost grief when you're like, I'm in a situation that I'm trying to kind of explain to you. And it isn't the other. You know, it's always the other that's going to be unwell or find themselves in a situation of dying with something like this. And it's just not. And that, I think, it's complex and it's really hard.
I can't imagine how vulnerable you felt. And do you still feel as vulnerable?
I'm here in Victoria, so we've had a really very serious lockdown in this state. And so I guess I feel safer, because there is such a conscious community effort to ensure that we are safe, and that there's been a really collective, not explicit, but everybody did what they should do, because it felt like they had a sense that we do all deserve to feel safe. So I actually do feel safer now than I did when it first happened. But it definitely sparked all of that grief and that kind of worry that you have that can kind of get unlocked at certain moments when you've got an illness.
As you said, your illness is invisible from the outside. How do the people around you know when you're having a bad day?
Close friends will know, and my family knows, I think, when you're having a bad day. But a lot of your life you spend working out how to hide it, because a lot of the time it's much harder to do that really lengthy explanation around the experience that you're having, because there's not much time for it really in our world for us to understand the dimensions, the dynamics of our health. And so a lot of the time you are just doing the best that you can to mask what's going on inside you. But I guess people that know me really well, I mean, there's just such fatigue and there's pain and there's a whole lot of stuff that will mean that maybe I can't keep up, I can't go out. So sometimes you've got to have told people around you what's happening. But yeah, the invisibility means that it's sometimes a lot easier just to keep it to yourself.
I imagine with the progression of an illness and the acceptance that you have one, there are milestones along the way. For you, it started soon after you met your partner, AJ. Do you remember that first day that you started to notice symptoms? Was it a day or was it a period of time?
For me, it was a period of time. It was a series of, what's that? That's, unusual, to the point where you begin to normalize your condition. Like, that's just who I am. I've spoken to people about this, and it's very similar. I think it's just those tiny little cuts, cut, that ends up becoming, for me, I couldn't walk by the time I found myself in hospital. But you just progressively learn how to live with the growing evidence that something's not right. And I certainly did that, especially when you're young and it collides with life and living, wild life that you have at that age. I didn't really notice at a time, but it just was a growing issue of a whole lot of symptoms.
You were in your 20s, weren't you? Your early or late 20s?
Early, yeah, 22, 23.
So that's a time when you can easily be forgiven for thinking, I'm a bit hungover, I had a dodgy curry, I had too many late nights, I've got period pain. Is that sort of the story you told yourself for a while?
Definitely, all of the above. You sort of oscillate between, maybe something's wrong, to, of course nothing's wrong. I think a lot of us are in that situation because we know in the back of our minds that things do go wrong, but it's always someone else, and often it's not you that thing will happen to. So you just sort of continue to play that game. And for the illness that I had, it's not something I really wanted to talk about. And you're totally right. Some of the symptoms were, maybe it's just I'm hungover, or I've, had some dodgy food, or I'm not looking after myself.
Do you remember what made you go and see a doctor to talk about it for the first time?
Just a progressive pain. I was just really becoming quite unwell to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore.
Can you describe the pain? Was it like, because you've had kids, so you know what labour pain feels like, you know what period pain feels like, you've obviously had food poisoning or upset stomachs. Where does it sit on that scale?
Good question. Very good question. I reckon for me, it's the beginning is a period pain sort of experience. So that's its kind of bedfellow, I would say. And with period pain, it's exacerbated as well. I think the menstrual cycle kind of dials it up somewhat. But it's that times, an extraordinary amount. So it's abdominal pain. And for me, it also became initially fistulas. So just enormous pain going to the toilet, enormous pain walking, sitting, doing all those sort of things. Plus fevers as well as another feature of it, and bone aches and huge fatigue. Then there's also blood loss that is coming through the bowel, as well as pus and all that sort of stuff, which is delightful to talk about. But there's a whole lot of stuff. And then, of course, an urgency to go to the toilet is one of the big things.
You said fistula. The only time that I've heard fistula mentioned before is Catherine Hamlin and her fistula clinics in Africa.
Yes.
And that was an injury that I understood happened in childbirth when very young women were forced or ended up giving birth and birth went wrong. What was a fistula in your case?
That was so interesting that you said that, because I hadn't really had the experience or understanding that this was something, that happened either. Really, I mean, I was aware that it was a possibility with my illness, but with Crohn's disease, the disease can actually be right from, your esophagus all the way down to your rectum. And so the disease in Crohn's disease travelled, and what it did was infection and abscesses right through my perianal area, which was a really horrific twist to the story. And that happened a little bit later on in the experience. The initial experience was fissures, but just when you have pain in that kind of perianal area, it's so unmasking. You feel really vulnerable because, of course, the pain is extraordinary. It's like, when you get an abscess in your tooth, it's like that every day, all the time, because the abscesses are sort of growing in that area, and it's just the nerve endings are extraordinary. And so even throughout that time, it's trying to sort of hide that, because that's a really hard conversation to have with people around what's happening with your body.
How did you come to describe it?
I often didn't tell a lot of people about that initially, because also, I mean, it's beautiful to tell you now, because it feels like, still for me, it's something that I have shame in my body over, and so I'm making an effort, because you feel this, I'm sorry, it's so disgusting. You feel this responsibility of that story for other people's experience. Oh, sorry, I don't want to upset you with this detail. And with every time that you apologize for it, I think it takes you further and further away from the rest of the world. And so, with some distance now, it's really liberating and wonderful to talk about it, because I think how absurd that we are weird about it, but how much it is that, the secrets of our body, so many people have this experience.
When you were diagnosed, was it a single diagnosis or it was progressive? And was it before Google or after Google?
How horrific that I have to admit it was, I think, pre-Google. Was there even a time?
But it's so important to note that, because when I often talk about having a miscarriage, I have to explain it was pre-Google. And when my husband had chronic fatigue syndrome, it was pre-Google. And that was just a very different landscape.
So different, because we are reliant at that point. So there's good and bad with that, because of course the kind of rabbit hole that you can go down with your own Google searches and your own diagnosis can be something, but it's also enormously empowering to have ways that you can research what's happening and find ways that you can ask questions, find people that are going through what you're going through. So yeah, exactly. Before that world opened up and there was connection, we're very reliant upon the authority of the doctor that you would go and see. And most of the time, well, a good portion of the time that was great, but there was definitely times where you're meeting people that are not up to date or not really sure about what's going on and are skeptical about what you're telling them or dismissive. And so you're very much at the mercy of whatever that diagnosis comes with, whatever frame that person sits in front of you with.
Was it a relief when it had a name?
Oh, it was a euphoria, I think, is what I would describe it as, because it felt like I was given a name. And I thought about this a lot. Naming things is really our power, isn't it? It's also our limitation. So often if you have a name for something, you also limit it. You don't understand it for its nuance and its dynamic range. But it also gives us a place to start. And it gave me a validity. Oh, gosh, I am sick. And it has got a parameter. Oh, this is what the illness is. And, of course, when I first was diagnosed, and I think a lot of people have described this to me as well, that diagnosis moment is this, yes, finally I am who I am. But then comes the shuddering reality of actually living with the diagnosis. And with chronic illness, it's really coming to terms with the fact that it will never end. And that is, I think, beyond the human mind in some ways to really perceive that.
I was going to ask you about what happens after the euphoria wears off, because how old were you when you were diagnosed?
So that was still around sort of early mid-20s, probably mid-20s, I'd say, when that diagnosis happened. And it just felt like a way that I could communicate it to friends, around me that had seen me, degenerate into the wellness or the unwellness that I was. But so great, here I am. But then there is very much a, okay, then on with it kind of attitude. Let's get on with life. Let's move forward. Let's find a way that, therapy will help you get back into the world. And there begins, again, a very layered and complex relationship with health and illness and how they intersect so wildly all the time.
What does it do to your sex life?
It definitely complicates it, for sure, especially as my illness progressed and my relationship was a really solid one. What eventually happened with the illness, which I'm sure we'll get to, it is exposing, and you're asking someone to accept and understand a body that's not normal. And again, the vulnerability of that is excruciating, because you are asking to be loved in the way that perhaps you haven't seen yourself. It's a horrific way, and it's an ableist way to think about it. But, I would think I'm not very attractive, I'm sorry. And that's a horrible thing to have inside you as a beating sense of a woman, that there is something not right and you are not attractive to a partner.
How did AJ deal with that?
In a most beautiful way, absolutely assuring. I always wondered how I would have coped with the whole landscape of my story without the affirming love of somebody who saw me for who I really was and not for my body and not for my illness. Having those eyes on you, if it's a family member, if it's a carer, having someone that can see your light, no matter where you end up going, is just such a beautiful anchor, because that's where you return. That's where you know you are. And I think when the landscape around you changes so much, having that beautiful sense of yourself as mirrored in somebody else is a gift.
For a lot of women, our 20s are a time of deep body insecurity. I mean, all our lives really, but our 20s is when it can feel its most raw. How did having a chronic illness impact on that side of things for you?
I remember walking past a window dressing, and there was a beautiful dress in there. And I think, this is possibly the time I had an ileostomy bag for a period. And I was like, I can't have that. I can't wear that. And I thought, that's sort of how I feel about my body. I can't want for or long for it to be beautiful. I have to shut that down. I have to break that link that I have to the love of my body, because it's too painful to have it being as difficult and cumbersome and heavy on me as it was. So that was a really important part to get back for me. But it was I think you're beautiful to mention it, because I think acknowledging that part of what this system has done to us, I think is really important for us to name it and to find our way back home.
Because you've got such a distinctive sense of style, from the way you cut your hair and bleach it to your clothes, your lipstick. You're incredibly cool.
Thanks, Mia.
You know you are. Really, you are. You're like super cool. You're like a super cool Melbourne person. And so obviously the way you present yourself to the world is part of your identity, and looked back at old photos of you, and it's always been part of your identity. I imagine that having an illness did impact on that.
Oh, so much of that. I think our identity is so, as you mentioned, especially throughout your 20s when you're developing an identity, how we project who we are in the world, we try and align our spirit with that. I think it's wrong to sort of say it doesn't matter. I think it does. But I think how we authentically do that is what we strive for, and what we eventually hopefully find, or if we're really smart, as our youngsters seem to be much more these days, they find it earlier. When it's been altered or changed, and your sense of your projection is something, again, that has been affected, it changes your sense of self. It has that dual impact. Outside and inside are talking. And when one is altered or affected, it has some kind of ramification on the other. And I think that's a really important part of what we need to understand as well, is identity. And especially when you're young and you get sick, how we can hold true to the self beyond the changes of our bodies and of the external expectation on what we should be.
Were there lifestyle factors that would affect your health in your 20s? Because it's a time of partying and keeping up with friends and drinking and taking risks and not eating very well. What were some of the things that impacted on you, both positively and negatively?
I think all of that's very true. I think stress, all the things that impact autoimmune are very present in your 20s. Anxiety, I know I had a lot of experience. I didn't write about that explicitly in the book because I felt like the mental health experience of illness is so embedded in it. It's not a separate thing. It is part of it, really. Being 20 and not having a lot of stability with your housing, with the way that you eat, with what you can afford to eat. You are kind of running on the edge as it is, let alone if you're not well, it kind of takes you to another place. But also that trying to work out, where is my responsibility with this, and where do I have to accept the illness is what it is? And I think I still grapple with that idea. Where am I, and where is this that I have to accept it as what it is? And, I think that is something that's hard in your 20s, taking that responsibility, growing up, working out what that means. Again, it's magnified with illness.
How bad did it get?
So bad. Eventually, sort of in my mid to late 20s, I ended up going on a drug trial. And I did it because I was in a public hospital system. I had no money. I was on Austudy, I think, or, I was studying, trying to do everything and being unwell. And I went on a drug trial because there was firstly the hope that the drug trial might actually benefit me. There might be a medication there. But I also felt like this is something I should do. I should actually be a participant in seeing if there's better cures for what my illness was. But I just got really, really sick on that. I think I must have been on a placebo rather than the actual drug. And I really wasn't monitored very well. And so the drug progressed to the point where the fistulas that we spoke about before started to take over my life, to the point where I couldn't do anything but go to work or go to school and then go to bed. I could barely walk. I couldn't sit. And I was just really, really, really sick.
So you went to hospital for a while?
Yeah. And at that point, they sort of said to me, look, the only way that we can look at starting to heal all the damage the fistulas have done, which is just holes. I had tubes coming out of my perianal area, like that were protruding and just really, really painful, was to get an ileostomy bag, which is an external waste bag that's attached to your stomach, and your ileum protrudes through your stomach. So basically, you go to the toilet in a bag on your stomach. And as a 20-something-year-old, I just couldn't imagine myself there. I just didn't understand how I could be loved anymore, which sounds phenomenal in that, of course you could be, but I just felt I was going to be useless, and I couldn't work after that, and I couldn't go to school, and I was pretty much leveled. So, in hospital, just sort of waking up after that operation and, feeling down and just being in enormous pain after that operation, but just like I felt quite ill at the idea of it.
Is that when you said to AJ you should leave?
Yeah, we eventually both had to move back to my parents' house, which, after years and years of independence, I needed to be cared for by my family, and we couldn't afford to rent anywhere, or we had no money. So I went back and I sort of thought, look, the enormous anger that I felt around this, I just was really cross, because it's a hard thing to explain, but I think the anger was just a really difficult time accepting where this had kind of just leveled me.
Of course, you felt ripped off. I don't think it's hard to understand. It's like, this was not the plan. This is not my beautiful life.
No, I felt reduced. There was nothing. I had nothing. I had no school. I had no jobs. I had no money. I had nothing. And I was, in my mid to late 20s trying to find my way in the world. What was really hard about it was also feeling the responsibility of other people. So firstly, you feel this responsibility to people that are carrying you. You feel like you're a burden. And to AJ, who we'd probably been together then 6 years or something. So it was a really established relationship. I just thought, I just want to let you go. I love you, and I don't want to have to put you through it, because it's also an enormously painful thing for me to have to feel this responsibility to you, who I love. And so I sort of planned it in the way that I just wanted to go underground. I didn't want to die, but I just didn't want to have to be responsible to other people anymore. So I just sort of took him aside one afternoon and I said, look, I'd love it if you weren't here anymore. And I think we can do it in a way where we can tell people that, you were great and it wasn't your fault, and make sure that no one blames you, but I don't want to do this anymore. I want you to go. His response to me has probably been the foundation for our relationship since then. He said, no, that's ridiculous. This is not you. This is us. This is who we are, and I think that's a really tough thing to carry. But it was a beautiful gift, because I didn't have a choice anymore. And so I was given the gift of, you stuck with me, sucker, and you just have to bear this and work out that I'm not doing this because I feel like I have to. I'm here because this is our story.
Were you surprised to get pregnant?
This is one of my absolute favorite things, and I'm so excited to tell you about this because I know you will love this, because it's a beautiful, crazy story. We've finally got back on our feet enough to go and rent a house again, and I'm not well enough to work, and I've been going into hospital like every 6 weeks to have an examination under anaesthetic. So you go under general anaesthetic and they clear out all the infection, and it's just awful, very invasive. And I would bleed a lot after those examinations. Like, you just wake up in blood. A lot of detail. But one afternoon I am vacuuming the house, and God knows why I thought this, but I had this random thought of, wouldn't it be terrible if someone went to hospital and had an operation or procedure and they didn't know they were pregnant, and they lost a child that they never knew they had because of the blood. You know, you would never know necessarily. And then just a beat later, I was like, imagine if that happened to me. Like, for no reason. I'm not a well person. There was no real likelihood of it. But in that moment, I decided to go down and get a pregnancy test. And so I went down to the chemist, came home by myself, AJ's at work, and I have a pregnancy test. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm due to go into hospital at 5 o'clock in the morning, like, you know, when you have those early starts. And I am pregnant.
Oh, my God.
And it was the most unbelievable twist. I mean, I'm partial to believe in the lovely synchronicities of the world. And there's no other way to explain that but a little bit of magic.
Someone really wanted to be born.
And it's a lovely story to share with the 16-year-old girl that sits in our lives now to say, you were coming. It's emotional for me to talk about even now because the whole birth was a really frightening time. So it's similar to diagnosis, this great euphoria and excitement, and then this shudder of reality of how do you birth with an ileostomy and with health that's really unstable. And so, you know, it was 9 months of just being really frightened. And then her actual birth, it was great. I got to read it to her in the book. It was a beautiful thing to say. You know, they had to actually knock me out for it. So I went under a general anaesthetic. And before I went under that general anaesthetic, I looked around the room and I said to everyone, can you please just do your best job? Because, you know, when you feel, and vulnerability again, you know, this sense of I have no control in the world. I've got nothing to offer you. There is nothing I can do to control this. I just implore you, could you, you know, do your best? And then I got knocked out. Before I was knocked out, the anaesthetist leant over and she said, you check your hand when you wake up because I'll write what you had, you know, whether you had a boy or a girl, and I'll write what time it was. So, you know, as I'm pulling myself out of the anaesthesia and waking up after giving birth, I check my hand and it's girl. You know, I think it was 8:49 or something written on there in black texter.
Oh, I've got chills. That's beautiful. Did you even think you could get pregnant and carry a baby? Like you were so used to your body being broken, the thought that it could make and grow a life.
This is really an emotional kind of part of it because it's like almost like when I asked AJ to leave me, it's like I can't bear the burden of anyone else. And to think that you have a life that you are responsible for and that you aren't very trustworthy, your body's not trustworthy. I think I suffered tremendously post-birth after it because of just the trying to come down from an enormous fear. I didn't think I could do it, and until I saw my hand and knew that she arrived, I didn't know that I could. And it took me a long time to recover, I think, from that feeling of fear that I think we all share. Birth is that dance between life and death, and we all sit there in this position of humility, but grand fear, I think, was also part of my story with that.
I might be being too Mary Poppins to ask you, but did that fear transcend into a deep respect for like, hey, I thought you were just a broken thing, but look what you did?
Yeah, you're totally right. I think this whole experience showed me strength that I never believed I had.
And functionality.
Yeah. And then I applied it to every part of my life. Everything is just a small step. We talk about it a bit, you know, with sort of ideas of the spiritual, I suppose, but that you surrender to a moment rather than a grand plan. So I think it really helped me come back and find myself for the real person that I was and am, I think. And not only the birth, but the illness has flattened me, but has shown me the strength of getting up and shown me the strength of, even though the body has got its failings, more than anything, it's how we can see it and have kindness to it through what we go through.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Jacinta Parsons. Did being pregnant make your condition worse?
For me, it actually improved it. It can go either way. I think from what I heard, and I don't know how much study there is to it, so this is just a reflection, but I do believe that apparently if, depending on how you go into that, it can be good or bad. So for me, I had a fairly good pregnancy in terms of my health. I still had the ileostomy bag. And, people would come, how people come up and touch your body when you're pregnant and it's like, hey, this is my actual space. But people come up and do it. People would inadvertently touch the ileostomy bag. And I would say, you know what, this is a good lesson for you. Do not go touching ladies' bodies because you don't know what's there.
That's so funny.
Yeah, so I think with enormous vulnerability, there is an absolute other side of that, and that is the strength that we all have. And it's horrific to find it in those moments that we wish we didn't have to sometimes. But for me, that's a truth of this story as well.
Was there also comedy when your daughter was small and changing nappies and changing bags and we're all in this together? Like, you must have adopted some dark humour.
You have tapped into something. I don't even know if I've told anyone this. Okay, this is really going there. Are you ready for this?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So she's little. I've got a freaking, in the hospital as well, my bag broke and I had to call the nurses who were not familiar with that sort of experience. So that is just the worst thing that can happen.
And you've had that happen before, right? Like in bed with your husband, like all the time. Like that's just a thing.
I think I was just crappy at being really good at making sure that they were working well. But anyway, I'm home with my baby and like the very first person that pooed on the other person was me on her because my bag. And I was like, oh my God, that is just so not okay and the worst thing that you can do. But I will be telling you that one day, my little darling girl.
We were talking about it's before Google. It's also before, like on Instagram now, there are all pictures of these influencers who have bags and they're in bikinis and it's this visibility that whether it's Chrissy Teigen showing what a miscarriage or a stillbirth looks like, or it's such a gift. And that's something that you and I, when we went through things, you feel so lonely, don't you?
Yeah, so lonely. And I mean, there's this beautiful community, and really it's a beautiful community. It's the Ostomate community that you belong to when you have an ileostomy or a colostomy bag. But you would get magazines sent to you, and they're really for an older population. So you're like, which crew am I in now? Like, the great stories of climbing the rock or, doing things, getting out into the world. I shouldn't say that, but, we're like these grand moments. And I was like, I just want to,
all the great nomads. I just want to go and dance on a podium.
That's right. Where is that photo? So it's so true. There's an enormous loneliness because also even though the internet was sort of vibrant, it wasn't like it is now where we've got these beautiful communities that can really build up around that visibility, like Instagram and visibility. It's a really good point.
Were you worried that you wouldn't be able to take care of your baby?
Yes. Oh, my gosh. I mean, yeah, when I first had a baby, I felt like I had a baby in the 70s because you know how everything's really cool now? Back then, it was just like everything was hard. We still had those, nappies that you would send off to get clean, the terry toweling ones that had no absorbency and stuff like that. Crazy.
Why did you do that? I had disposables, girlfriend.
Well, no, I'd switched to them because then they ended up being this whole recyclable thing. But I'm just saying, like, it was the 70s in a way. It felt like it wasn't, but it felt like the dark ages.
It was harder.
It was hard. And just being unwell and not having energy. And I think I really felt it when she was a couple of years old, where she's like, dude, can you just play with me? And I'd be like, I'm just so tired, and just it's hard at the best of times. But then when you're sick on top of it, I just remember her looking at me going, why don't you just do something about this? in the way that a small child would tell you, like, dude, this is getting really boring for me.
Sort yourself out.
Go and see a doctor.
Not fun.
She actually said to me, go and see a doctor and get better. It's like, mate, and I did all this research then around how do you explain a chronic ill life to a child? There was nothing about it. So I just worked out I have to be really explicit with her on what's happening. I explained the doctors, what they looked like, the rooms that I went into and what they told me. Just so she was like, all right, so there is something happening. There is something with you. Yeah, so it was really tough.
I thought I was going to want to know more about your sex life, but what I actually want to know about is the power dynamic between you and AJ. I mean, feel free to talk about sex if you want to, but my view on that is that men's sexual drive is fairly robust and they're not put off by many things. But in terms of the power dynamic of you being ill and him being the carer, how have you navigated that? Because that can become a bit of a toxic power dynamic, I imagine, if you're not conscious about it.
Oh, I think it's so hard. It's so hard because both people in that dynamic we both need love and kindness and understanding, but we are both functioning for each other outside of that. Do you know what I mean? So as a carer, you need to be cared for outside of the person you're caring for. And as someone who's been cared for, you need to be seen as an autonomous, strong person. You know, you're not the function together. It's really, really hard. And I think, you know, I don't necessarily think we were incredible at it by any stretch, but we both did our best in understanding what it meant to do it. You know, I fought it. I think I was really cross about it. So I wasn't great to care for, but also at the same time, what I needed and what he gave, you know, there was a constant navigation around what it is. What is it to care for me, I think, is really hard. And I think that's another unseen part of this is the carer. People who are loving and supporting people who are in, you know, great need. How we do it and then maintain functioning relationships inside that, I think, is so, so tough.
Did you have sort of, not rules, but boundaries around what he would do for you, what he wouldn't, those kinds of things? Or have you just sort of worked it out as you've gone along?
We just worked it out as we went, really. And I think we sort of stumbled into it. I think it's one of those things, you know, even sometimes our relationships are like this where you find yourself in the middle of it. Even more so, a sick relationship where you've got a carer, you don't really know that that's about to happen to you. So almost you find yourself in the middle of it before you've had time to really work out what it means. And I think that's a really good point. I think having some kind of understanding around that and how people are supported to do that with each other, I think is a really key thing that's missing in how we navigate this stuff. We were in hospital and I had the ileostomy bag. And it just had happened and we were just distraught by the experience. And a nurse came up and said to both of us, you know, relationships don't last this sort of thing. Yeah.
Jesus. Oh my
and
God.
We were alone and we just felt young and vulnerable and we used to muck around and have a great laugh about that.
What a psychopath.
It felt like that.
Yeah. Like that's a psychopathic thing to say.
Imagine doing that to a young couple.
Imagine doing that to anybody. Like that's just cruel.
Yeah, it was really, really cruel. Really cruel.
Also, fuck her, you did.
You know what? Check it out. You know?
Suck on that bitch.
Yeah. I know. I feel like going back and check out what actually happened. But I think that's a missing element of our healthcare support is all the rings around people. How do they work? You know, we're getting better at it, I think. We have those trees of loving, you know, when people, what are they called? When people have babies and you make food and do all that sort of stuff. Or
oh, yeah, the food trains and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and you get a little bit of that with illness. But when it's a protracted experience, how do you do it? And I think more support for the supporters and the carers is essential.
You waited 8 years to have another baby. Was that another accident or?
Yeah, I just wasn't well enough.
Oh, you were going to be one and done.
No, we really wanted another child and just couldn't have a child. So tried really hard. And then, and then we got pregnant with this little guy who's with us now as well. But and I had a miscarriage between.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Was your pregnancy with your son better? Were you less scared?
No, I wasn't actually. I ended up getting a liver condition and I was really sick at the time as well. So it just was.
Oh, look, that's not great.
Do you know what? And I don't know how you feel about this, but I think trauma layers upon itself. It doesn't, once you've gone through stuff that's really traumatic, I don't think you go, okay, I get it. I think getting sick and having illness stuff, you just realize life is really fragile and actually really intense and it's actually shit goes wrong. And so I think once you've seen that kind of behind the curtain, it's really hard to really trust it I think that there's something to that that's really significant and important as well. Is you lose your resilience a little bit to it sometimes as well. You grow it in lots of ways. You become strong, you become really focused, but also you become, there is triggers for your fear. And being pregnant again was a trigger for me for sure.
This past year or two where you've been well and your kids are now 8 and 16, have you exhaled a little bit?
Yeah, I have. Almost to the point where it's been beautiful to touch into this kind of story about health and illness, because there's a tenderness to it now rather than being in the middle of a storm. There's a love of an experience that's been really, really tough, but has borne also enormous fruit for me, like of life, of really true, deep life has come from it. So I do feel like I have been able to breathe out and see the life that has come from it has been extraordinary, really. And I didn't write about that in the book because I feel like everyone's got to find their own path. Like those hero stories in illness, I think are really great. But I also think describing it for what it really is doesn't have to have your good outcome to truly understand it. But for me, it's been an enormous teacher of life and love and strength and humility and sort of knowing that it's all a bit of a game, life is just a beautiful opportunity.
You can hear Jacinta every afternoon on ABC Radio in Melbourne, and her book Unseen is available now. You'll find the link in the show notes. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff, and I'm Mia Friedman. I'll see you at mamamia.com.au.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.